that occurred in Dallas, Texas. The body was brought here at 6:35 p.m. Now the body was brought around the back of the hospital, and it was brought in by a team of honor guards. The Boyajian report tells us that the autopsy received the body at 6:35 p.m. that evening. Strangely, Jackie Kennedy and the ambulance she was riding in, the hearse, with the casket from Dallas, arrived here at 5 minutes to 7, over 20 minutes later. I spoke to a man named Jim Jenkins. Jim Jenkins worked on the autopsy here on November 22nd, 1963. Jim had just turned 21 years old on July 9th of 63, and on November 22nd, he was working here. His normal partner that day would have been a man named Stanley Miller, but due to mixing and matching in people's schedules, he worked with a man named Paul O'Connor. Jim was a pathological assistant. He worked in the lab, and he was taking courses in his part of his duties here in the Navy. So he was called to duty that day and told to report to the morgue in the back of the Naval Hospital at about 3 o'clock. He stayed there until 9 o'clock the next morning, but he was missing for one portion when he and others were ordered to leave. Jim worked with Commander Boswell, and he was stationed at the head of the body in the autopsy. He remembered when the autopsy began. He remembered at about 8 o'clock when the autopsy started. The head of the president, the head of the body, was unwrapped with a towel. A towel was taken and simply thrown against the wall and slid down to the floor. It was drenched in blood. One thing that he had noticed when the autopsy began was that there had already been some kind of procedure done to the president's head. This was before the autopsy even began at 8 o'clock. How this happened? Who was it done by? When was it done? He doesn't know. So I heard Jim speak at a seminar, and then I arranged to meet with him about a year later. And we got together and we talked for about 2.5 hours. And Jim was open, he was honest, he spoke freely, and he talked about everything that he saw that night. What did he see? He saw a lot of tension. There was a lot of tension in the room because he felt that the admirals and the generals in the gallery sitting off to the side, I mean, there were about 31 people in the room, in this small room. He felt that they were directing the autopsy and that the 3 doctors who were working on the autopsy, Commander Hume, Commander Boswell, and Lieutenant Colonel Pierre Fink, he felt they were being directed to proceed towards a predetermined conclusion. That is, that one person shot President Kennedy. But from the evidence that he saw, from what was seen by Jim Jenkins, there was clearly more than one assassin. They were not allowed to dissect, to examine in any way, or to investigate President Kennedy's throat wound. That was off limits. They did examine the back wound. He said he saw Commander Hume stick his little finger into the back wound, and it only went in to a depth of about 1.25 inches, and it had a remarkable, significant downward angle. Then they took a probe and tried to stick the probe through to see how far this bullet wound had gone. But it only went in, as he said, about 1.25 inches. Now that's significant. Where was that bullet? The level of this wound on President Kennedy's back, that's important. And with that significant downward angle, there's no way that that bullet could have come out President Kennedy's throat. That was a physical impossibility. Also, when they removed the lungs, and it was Jim Jenkins's duty to fill out the face sheet. Now the face sheet was the front of the autopsy report, and it had a diagram of the body. It didn't have 2 diagrams of the body as the face sheet that we see. It only had 1 diagram of the body, and that was the front of the body, and on the reverse side was the diagram of the back. Boswell and Jenkins removed the organs. They were weighed, and Boswell described them to Jenkins, who wrote down the description and the weights on the face sheet. But that's not the face sheet that we see. Somebody else did this. And somebody else made these corrections. Somebody else totally reconstructed this face sheet. This is not the one that was done at the autopsy. They took out the lungs so that when they shined a light into the lung, into the cavity, the thoracic cavity, you could see right through to President Kennedy's back. Jim Jenkins clearly saw with his own eyes that the wound in the back stopped at the pleura. The wound in the back stopped at the pleura. It did not go through the pleura. It did not go into the lungs. It did not go through the lungs. The pleura is the lining which goes around the lungs. That pleura had not been pierced. There was no hole. There was no route for the bullet to go through the thorax, through the lung cavity. And being at the level of the fourth thoracic vertebra, going down, the bullet clearly did not go through President Kennedy's body. Jim Jenkins also saw the wound in the side of President Kennedy's head, right here, just above the temple, just above the ear, just in front of the ear. You can see on this photograph here where I've placed a red dot. That's where the bullet went in. And the bullet from there went to the back of the head. Jim Jenkins explained to me in detail that the damage to President Kennedy's cranium was far more extensive than the damage to the brain that was removed during the autopsy. He also noticed that the brain that was removed had actually been removed and replaced. He could tell that because the carotid arteries on each side of the skull, each side of the brain, retracted. That means they shriveled up. And by being so shriveled up, that meant that they had been cut a substantial period of time before they conducted this autopsy. That's amazing. That's absolutely amazing. He also noticed that the brain that they took out of the body was in remarkably good shape for the damage that had been done to the cranium, the skull. It didn't make sense to him. And this brain, he said, appeared to be the brain from a much younger person. The brain of President Kennedy at over 46 years of age. There would have been far more marks, like a road map, indentations, lines, sections. But that's not what he saw in this brain. And in the autopsy, in the morgue, there was another casket, a second casket, sitting off to the side. And everybody in the autopsy was told, do not open that lid. They were threatened. People in the autopsy were actually threatened. They were threatened with imprisonment and loss of their Navy pension if they ever spoke about what they saw at the autopsy. As a matter of fact, Jim never talked about this autopsy, what he saw, even to his wife for many, many years. Not until he was contacted by the Assassination Records Review Board. And at that time, the testimony of Jim Jenkins that's recorded by FBI agent Jim Kelly was not at all what he said. So what he told the FBI agents is not what ended up on paper. And of course, Jim is very upset about that, and he's very reluctant to talk to people. It wasn't easy for me to convince him to talk to me, and he didn't want to go on camera, which is why I'm telling you this here now about what he told me, because I think it's so important and so compelling that the American people understand what happened to President Kennedy at the autopsy. President Kennedy's body was really the subject of another crime. This was just as criminal as what happened in Dallas. This was an extension of the crime. And for that reason, I firmly believe that there has to be a disinterment. President Kennedy's body has to be exhumed and it has to be re-examined again, because we're never going to get at the truth until we have a real autopsy, an impartial autopsy with whatever is remaining. Now, the bullet wound in the side of the head. This is the bullet wound that was described by Malcolm Kilduff. It was a bullet wound near the temple, and it even had the gray residue left over from the entrance of the bullet. And the bullet entered by the temple and went out the back. It went basically from the right front, around the ear, inside, in a straight line, missing the ear, but coming out the back of President Kennedy's head, very much like what Dr. Charles Crenshaw said that he observed at Parkland. So Jim felt that when Crenshaw came out with that interview with Tom Jarrell back about 1992, he said he felt that his story was now corroborated by what Crenshaw had to say. But the only way we're going to ever be able to arrive at the truth of what happened in the assassination of President Kennedy in 1963 is if the body is disinterred, exhumed, and subjected to an honest, true, authentic, and investigative autopsy. which is designed to determine the truth and not to cover up what happened in Dallas in 1963. At the very end of the autopsy, Jim Jenkins said one of the most disgusting events occurred. That was that Admiral George Berkeley and Admiral Galloway, who were in the gallery and directing the autopsy, instructed Commander Humes, who was the head of the autopsy team, to remove President Kennedy's testicles. And they objected. But they were reminded that they were outranked. By disobeying this order, they would be subject to discipline, which could include losing their pensions and imprisonment. So President Kennedy's testicles were removed for no medical reason. There was no justification for doing that, other than the fact that this is a typical mafia-type hit, where they say, we're going to kill the bastard and we're going to cut his balls off. And that's exactly what happened. It's